So I want to talk about why I actually think what I call the Greater Boswash Corridor is actually the most European feeling region of the world outside of Europe itself. Now, when I say European, I mean in several regards. I mean literally like Europe. I don't just mean having a white population. I mean feeling like Europe in general. Now, there are a number of other regions that I think many people would suggest are the most European outside of Europe, but the reason I'm going to get into why I actually think it is the Boswash corridor as opposed to some of these other regions. I think what actually makes the Boswash corridor most European is the fact that it is the only region in not just in North America, but really of any European descended place outside Europe itself that fits certain criteria. For starters, yes, it does have, or at least recently had, a majority white population. And that's something that would definitely disqualify many places in Latin America that feel otherwise European in many other regards. For instance, many parts of central and southern Mexico that have a lot of historic architecture and walkability, but aren't majority European descent, like aren't majority white and haven't been for a very long time, if frankly, if ever. I'm not actually sure about that, but I think some parts of northern Mexico might have been at one point, but I don't think central or southern Mexico ever were. Correct me if I'm wrong. But anyway, my point is, okay, so there's the ethno-racial aspect, but there's also the fact that in terms of density, walkability, and transit, it's one of the few regions that even comes close to lining up to Europe. Because when you look at the Boswash corridor, there's regular Amtrak service between all the major cities multiple times per day in both directions. Some of it kind of almost counts as even high speed rail, though some would argue it's not true high speed rail, but it's definitely high speed by not just North American standards, but any European diaspora country, like be it, Australia, New Zealand, Argentina, what have you. By the standards of any of these places, it definitely is, I think, the highest speed rail of any majority white or recently majority white part of the world outside of Europe itself. So there's that. And there's also the fact that there's also a lot of passenger rail that reaches smaller cities and towns too, although not nearly extensive enough, but still far more extensive in terms of like commuter rail, in terms of Amtrak, even in terms of the subway, which reaches certain suburbs that are even like small towns in some cases that are part of the metropolitan area. And like when looking at all these different forms of passenger rail, like it has a far more comprehensive passenger rail system than any other region of North America, and by extension, I would say of the entire European diaspora. So basically, when I say European diaspora, I mean places that are majority white or at least were recently. And that's the sad thing. We're getting to the point where you have to make that qualifier more and more. But yeah. And not only that, but the region has a lot of small towns, smaller cities, like not just the main cities, which are Washington, D.C., Baltimore, Philadelphia, New York City, and Boston, but also some of the smaller cities and smaller towns too, like places like Frederick, Maryland, Lancaster, Allentown, like a whole bunch of cities in Pennsylvania, like Lancaster, Allentown, Bethlehem, Harrisburg, Reading, Newport, Rhode Island, Princeton, New Jersey, and a bunch of these like smaller, like touristy places, like like Harper's Ferry, West Virginia, or Jim Thorpe, Pennsylvania, or Provincetown, Massachusetts, Nantucket, like places that have a lot of historic architecture and walkability. And some of these places are connected by rail transit to other cities, others are not. But nonetheless, the fact that there's just so many, not just big cities, but smaller cities that have a significant amount of historic architecture and walkable neighborhoods. Not just historic architecture, but what I like to call the outdoor room, which is a term that Leon Creer uses in his books to describe essentially buildings that are connected to each other or very close together. And they create this feeling of being in an enclosed area, an outdoor room, so to speak. And in my opinion, that's what makes these old neighborhoods so beautiful, even compared to, like, let's say what I call proto suburbia. And proto suburbia is basically like neighborhoods from the late 19th century, early 20th century that still have traditional style architecture, but the houses are a lot further apart, kind of like modern suburbia. And I think what distinguishes these old neighborhoods is that the buildings either are connected or are closer together, and thus have the outdoor room feeling, which I think is crucial to the ambience of historic neighborhoods. It's what makes them so beautiful, so Instagrammable, as people would say. Like it's what creates the visual beauty of these neighborhoods. And I think, yeah, there's a lot of places like that in the greater Boswash corridor. And also a lot of public transit within the cities themselves, a lot of walkability within like the major cities, walkability and transit, both in the form of like subways and commuter rail. But yeah, there's a lot of all these traits really, which in my opinion are very European, like the emphasis on walkability, transit, not just transit within cities, but between cities, historic architecture, like all these features, in my opinion, are much more ubiquitous as a whole in this region compared to other regions in North America and the European diaspora as a whole. Now, obviously, a lot of these cities and towns aren't like perfectly well preserved. Like they're not on the level of a city like Rome or say like Lisbon, or even like on the level of like Edinburgh or Vienna in terms of like the extent to which like the percentage of the buildings that are historic buildings. Like it's a bit hit and miss from, neighborhood to neighborhood, street, like block to block, street to street, even building to building. It can be hit and miss. But nonetheless, I would say by European diaspora standards, by North American standards and European diaspora standards as a whole, um this region has a lot of historic architecture. It has a lot. And I mean, yeah, some of it was destroyed, unfortunately, in the mid 20th century because of the stupidity that was ubiquitous during that era. The West End in Boston, I think, was a particularly shameful example of this. Also, Penn Station in New York City. Like, there are several examples in the region that are just particularly horrendous. But nonetheless, I mean, despite that fact, I mean, there's still a lot more historic architecture in this region, not just in the big cities, but in the smaller cities and small towns and villages too, compared to other parts of North America and the European diaspora as a whole. And I think that's really a big differentiating factor. And there's other factors too, like say, up until recently, the region kind of had its own accents that were quite common, and I think that actually makes it feel more European in a way, in the sense of having that like local charm and character. Like even if they don't have their own languages, like when you're in Europe and you go from one country to the next, and it's like the size of a U.S. state, and suddenly they're speaking a different language. It's like, okay, maybe it's not quite to that extent, but at least they had their own accents. Although that unfortunately is dying out, you know, in the region. And you can see it even like, as I've said before, in TV shows like in The Sopranos, how like Carmela and Tony have the Jersey accent, but Meadow and AJ, their children, barely have it at all. So yeah, I mean, that's an unfortunate thing, but nonetheless, there is the fact that at least until recently they had that. Also, they have a lot of their own distinct styles of food that are quite noteworthy, like New York style pizza, lobster rolls, like from New England, Maryland crab cakes, Philadelphia cheesesteak sandwiches, New York style hot dogs, the chopped cheese sandwich from New York. Like I'm sure there's a lot of stuff I'm forgetting, but like those are certain food items that are definitely associated with the region. So like yeah, they have their distinct culinary heritage also. And So I think now that I've established some of the reasons, and also, oh yeah, museums. How could I forget that? Like they have some of the best museums in actually, I would say in terms of museums that I'd actually say they do line up with the best parts of Europe, even like the museums in this region, like on a per capita basis, amazing in that regard. Like you have the Smithsonian Museums in Washington, D.C., Philadelphia Museum of Art, the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City, and also the American Museum of Natural History. Did I get the name correct? I think so. Also in New York City. I found the Brooklyn Museum a bit disappointing when I went there, but that was like 2002, so maybe it's gotten better since then. I don't know. Funny story. When I was at the Brooklyn Museum, okay, what me and my dad noticed is they had a bunch of artwork, like sculptures and stuff, and it was just lying around in the parking lot there. It was like in this like parking area behind the museum, and this was like actual artwork, and they just had it like sitting out there. It like they were storing it there, and there was so much of it, and I was like, I was honestly shocked. Like it wasn't like bolted in place or anything like that. It's just it's like they just dumped it there. All this artwork. And I'm like, what the hell is up with this? And large parts of the actual museum seemed like they were empty, but yet a bunch of artwork was just sitting in this like parking lot behind the museum or something like that, or on the side or whatever. It was really weird. But anyway, I digress. Um yeah, and also the Boston Museum of Fine Art as well. So yeah, there's a lot of great museums in the region. Also historic mansions, like in Newport, Rhode Island, especially. It has some mansions that are like damn near like actual palaces, like the Breakers, for instance. Utterly gorgeous. From the Gilded Age. Capitalism giveth and capitalism taketh away. So I guess that's one of the examples of where it giveth. Like that's the thing. I find like capitalist systems can produce beautiful things, but without safeguards, they have a tendency to destroy a lot of those things too. And that's why some amount of government intervention is necessary to protect heritage properties. So there's that. Like I think a lot of that, and generally the fact that it's a more liberal and collectivist region by American standards, like not hyper individualistic. And I'm not trying to say that being liberal is necessarily a good thing, at least not in every way. As I've said, like I'm kind of, neither left nor right. I guess you could say I'm more third positionist, but in the sense of like not being hyper individualistic, not being hyper libertarian, like aside from New Hampshire, which is a bizarre outlier in the region, it's like left libertarian, which I honestly I find it hard to understand New Hampshire's political leanings. It's a bit of a weird anomaly. And I mean, New Hampshire's sort of part of this region. I'm going to get into like the exact boundaries of what I would consider this region. But yeah, I would say overall, those are some of the traits that delineate why, in my opinion, this is the most European region of the European diaspora, like outside of Europe, in terms of the general vibe. Now, okay, all that said, okay, I'm going to try to now define what exactly this area is, because I've been referring to it, but I haven't really defined the exact boundaries. So how I would define it, I would basically say it contains the main Boswash corridor, which is the main 5 cities, Washington, D.C., Baltimore, Philadelphia, New York City, and Boston, as well as other cities like Providence, Rhode Island, and dishonorable member of the region, Hartford, Connecticut. Fuck Hartford. All my homies hate Hartford. Seriously. Watch Alexander Rotman's video on Hartford. My gosh, look how they massacred my boy. Like, oh my gosh, they ruined that city. So dishonorable mention for that, but also, you could even include Albany to some extent. You can include a lot of the cities in Pennsylvania, like Lancaster, Harrisburg. What's the other ones? Reading. Just the entire like southeastern Pennsylvania region, where you have a lot of these like kind of small and medium-sized historic cities. I would say most of Maryland and Delaware would be included. Probably the DC suburbs of Virginia, but not that much of Virginia as a whole. Although some people might expand this to include like Richmond, perhaps. I don't know. You could or could not. It's debatable. Um, yeah, New Jersey as a whole would be included. I'd say with New York, definitely the whole New York City metropolitan area. You could or could not arguably include Albany and that whole region. I would say all of Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and some of the like coastal regions of New Hampshire. And I guess a little bit of Maine too, maybe like Portland, Maine. I could create a map of this and have a link to it just to show kind of the rough area I'm talking about. And I did a recent video on what I called like the greater North American Northeast. And obviously, this is all part of that greater region. And I think that greater region as a whole is the most European of the like large regions of North America. But I think this sub-region is the most European on a sub-regional level, specifically. Because even in the greater North American Northeast, you get a lot of parts that are just nowhere near as European as this. Like you get areas like Atlantic Canada, which is just a lot more sparsely populated and car dependent. Upstate New York, which again, much more car dependent, less walkable. I mean, I would say there's other subregions that feel kind of that have these elements to an extent. Like I would say between Toronto and Quebec City along that corridor, and also Chicago itself, and maybe you could throw in Madison, Wisconsin to an extent with it. Although Madison's not really that historic per se, but kind of walkable. But nonetheless, I would say the reason why the greater Boswash corridor is more this way is because there's a lot more connectivity in terms of transit, like regular transit between the different cities and even to smaller cities in the region, be it Amtrak or commuter rail, or even subways in some cases to like smaller cities, smaller towns within the metropolitan areas and in some cases outside of them. And there's just a lot of that in the region. Plus, as I said, historic small towns and smaller cities, medium-sized cities. So I think just the sheer preponderance of this, because there's a lot of places like that in this region, not just the well-known cities and like tourist towns, but a lot of ones that aren't as well-known, especially in southeastern Pennsylvania. Like there's a ton of them there. And I just think that like the sheer number of these types of cities and towns and villages makes it more European overall than anywhere else in the European diaspora. And I think, as I've said, like when looking at other regions, there are certain parts of Mexico that would fit this, but it's not white enough. That's the thing. It's not European enough in terms of the population and also in terms of like the general vibe, because I think Mexico, being what it is, the type of society it is, just has a much more kind of third world vibe overall, even if it does have some very historic, very, in some ways, European looking architecture, like very Spanish influenced. Like, I don't think the architecture is the only factor to look at here. I'm not sure how good Mexico is in terms of passenger rail. I've never been to Mexico, and I've looked it up online. I've seen very conflicting results on this. So I don't know. But nonetheless, I think it's kind of categorically excluded for ethno-racial demographic reasons, frankly, because I am talking about the European diaspora here, which is like basically countries that are white majority or were recently white majority, or regions of countries that are white majority or were recently that are outside of Europe itself. So basically like Canada, US, Australia, New Zealand, Argentina, Uruguay, southern Brazil. I guess those would be the ones that would typically be included. I mean, Chile is kind of more castizo, I would say. I guess they're an honorable mention. And you could, even though whites were never the majority, you could almost say South Africa up till 94, simply because it was a very white dominated society. It had that European diaspora vibe. But out of all these places, I would say, yeah, like basically the Boswash corridor feels the most European for all the reasons I outlined. Like, I mean, I can't think of anywhere else that really has these to the same extent. Like, there's individual cities that definitely do, like, say, New Orleans, Charleston, Savannah, Quebec City, Montreal. But the thing is, a lot of in these regions where these other cities are, or also you could include like Buenos Aires or even parts of Sydney and Melbourne. But the thing is, with all these cities, it's just there's not all the smaller towns and smaller cities in the same region that also have a lot of historic architecture and walkability and in some cases even transit connections. Like when you're looking at like kind of the combination of all these things, it really just dwarfs anywhere else in the European diaspora for having so much of it. Even when you look at Quebec, for instance, like a lot of people do say Quebec is the most European feeling region outside of Europe. And there's some truth that, like, I might say Quebec City is the most European feeling city. But the thing is, with Quebec, like, outside of Quebec City and Montreal, there's not really that much historic architecture to speak of. It's always something I found really disappointing. Like when I was younger and Google Maps, like Google Street View first became a thing, I kept looking up all these places in Quebec, like hoping to find more places that are like Quebec City or Montreal with the historic architecture. I couldn't find anywhere. I think Trois Rivières was like that for a while, but they had a great fire, I think, in the either around the turn of the century between the 19th and 20th centuries. So it destroyed the vast majority of that, unfortunately. But yeah, I mean, outside of Quebec City and Montreal, it's not that great in terms of walkability or historic architecture, sadly, or transit connections, frankly, like rail transit, like passenger rail transit of any kind. Yeah, in those regards, sadly, the rest of Quebec doesn't measure up that well. I mean, even Gatineau doesn't really. Like it's I mean, in terms of walkability maybe, but it's not that great in terms of historic architecture. Um and it's kind of lacking in the like passenger rail transit department also. Like you hit basically the closest passenger rail transit is in Ottawa. So, yeah, I mean, the rest of Quebec just doesn't stack up as well. So it's really just two cities that are like that. Whereas in the Boswash corridor, it's a whole bunch of cities and like big cities, smaller towns, and maybe none of them individually is quite as beautiful as Quebec City, like the old town of Quebec City. But as a whole, I think it's still has more of that European vibe overall because when you look at the whole thing and not just the two specific cities, like in the case of Quebec. Now, obviously, there's other elements too. Like I'm talking about this very much in terms of like architecture, walkability, and transit and population density and things like that. But people could say, like, again, I think there's a certain conceit where it's like people don't view the Anglosphere as truly European, even the UK for that matter. They don't view it as truly European, so they associate being European with like speaking a continental European language. And I'm trying to avoid that here. I'm trying to look at it more like, including English as a European language, including the English people as a European people, which region feels the most European. And I do think overall, I think it is the Boswash corridor for the reasons I've outlined. Now, I mean, there are certain detractors. Like the biggest detractor in this regard, there are several. Number one, to be frank, the fact that it's part of the United States. The fact that it's part of the United States means that it is subject to US federal law or lack of certain laws. Like for instance, the fact that there's no guaranteed vacation time in the United States. I believe that's actually determined at a state level, but no state has opted to guarantee vacation time. At least I don't think any state has. I could be wrong. But yeah, they get no vacation time in the United States, including this region. And I think that's a very un-European thing, frankly. Also, the lack of public health care. Again, very un-European. The fact that higher education costs so ridiculously much, again, very un-European. So just certain things that are like realities simply as a result of being in the United States in and of itself. And another would be, of course, the homicide rate. As with much of the US, like the homicide rate is way higher than anywhere in Europe, almost anywhere in Europe, like anywhere in Western Europe, and then almost anywhere, well, most places in Eastern Europe, although obviously, like, yeah, European Russia is kind of the exception there. And I think Ukraine, even before the war, their homicide rate was a bit high by European standards. But I mean, aside from those regions, yeah, compared to Europe, obviously the homicide rate is higher by virtue of being in the US and having US issues to contend with, uh, in terms of like demographics, income inequality, perhaps less comprehensive social services, far more civilian firearms and wider availability of firearms. Like all these factors do contribute to varying degrees to the homicide rate. And again, now, I don't want to perpetuate the myth that the US is like much worse than Europe in every aspect of crime, because that's actually bullshit. It's really only homicide where the US is an outlier according to official statistics. With many other crimes, as I've said before in many other videos, US is close to much of Western Europe, although US is higher than Eastern Europe. And I think demographics are the obvious factor here. But I mean, when looking at crimes like robbery, burglary, and theft, in fact, US clusters with much of Western Europe on these, close to the Western European average, and also closer to Canada also on these other crimes. It's really just homicide where the US is a major outlier. The homicide rate actually has gone down significantly this past year compared to beforehand. It's I think around 4 per 100,000, but that still puts it as like 4 times as high as the European Union per capita. So, and also the discrepancy seems to be much higher in many of the major cities. So there's that. Like there's that whole issue. People could debate to what extent the homicide rate actually affects the typical person in day-to-day life. I think it depends a lot on your own psychological composition. Are you more afraid of something that is worse but less common or less obvious? Or are you more afraid of something that is less bad but more pervasive? So, like, yeah, something that is worse but less pervasive, or less bad but more pervasive. Like, I think different types of people process different danger differently. But my point is, like, would it be the homicide rate that scares you, or would it be the rates of other far more common crimes like burglary or theft or robbery? I don't know. It's an interesting question. I actually did a poll once, and most people said that they are more scared of homicide. So I guess maybe in that sense, yes, it would have a major, at very least, psychological impact on people. And that would be okay. That would be another thing, is like, okay, obviously the car accident death rate, even though in this region, in many cities and towns, you can live without a car, or at least live without relying entirely or mostly on a car. But nonetheless, the car accident death rate would still be higher than in most parts. I think higher than pretty much every country in Western Europe, and higher than many parts of Eastern Europe, although not all. And again, that's another just factor of being in the United States, frankly. Even if it's one of the lowest parts of the United States for the car accident death rate per capita, I think it would still be overall significantly higher than in most of Europe, and also higher than Canada. I think higher than Australia and New Zealand too. Although it would, I think, beat out the Southern Cone in this regard. Yeah, they're not so great on that statistic. Same with homicide; they're not so great on that statistic either in the Southern Cone. But Yeah. And also Russia, as I mentioned, with both homicide and car accidents, wouldn't do so great. But yeah, I mean, there's some pros and cons to all this. Like, there's definitely factors for and against the argument for why it's the most European feeling region of the European diaspora overall outside of Europe itself. But that's my opinion anyway. And I hope that at very least acknowledging this helps mend some of the wounds that have been created lately by all this animosity between Americans and the rest of the European diaspora, frankly, and Europe itself as well. Like, just all this animosity that the Trump administration has created, constantly flinging shit at every other white country on the planet, and frankly every other country period aside from like Israel. But yeah, I mean, hopefully acknowledging this goes to show that like maybe not all of America is that different from Europe. I mean, yeah, many parts definitely are. And of course, that's the thing. I'm sure many of these MAGA types would say, oh, the Boswash corridor, the greater Boswash corridor, they're not true Americans. They're cucks, they're collectivists, they might as well not be Americans at all. Like, some of them will say that. Except when it comes to 9/11. When it comes to 9/11, suddenly they're 100% American. But otherwise, or of course, when they're arguing with a non-American, they'll act like the U.S. is entirely united. But then amongst themselves, they will say, "Oh no, these specific parts of the U.S. are un-American." So I don't know, but at the same time, I think that is at very least on a regional level, that is something that's great about the identity of this region. And I hope that they can maintain these aspects of their civilization, of their culture, and not just become another generic region of the US. So yeah, I guess those are my thoughts on that, and that's all for now.